Welcome back to CTN. I'm your host, Robert Van Sluten. Let's get started. In the last episode, we were exploring storyboarding, and I had indicated that in this episode, we would dig into the workings of the utility application you get when you select the utility application template. And the reason for that exercise is that it's a very good example of the basics of segues in storyboarding. Before we get started though, going into the code and the items in the storyboard, let's actually run the application and see what it does. Okay, when you run this, what you get is this blank view that just simply has an information button down the bottom. If I tap on that, it flips over. This is a different view controller in view. There's a navigation bar on the top. If I hit the done button, we flip back. Same structure as the weather app and the stock app. Alright, let's start looking at the code. Okay, we have two classes of interest here. There's a class called UI Storyboard Segue, and this particular application uses a UI navigation bar, which is the top bar on the flip side screen. There's two methods in UI View Controller of interest. There's a prepare for segue, and this allows you to get ready for the segue transition in the view controller you're leaving from. And there's a dismiss view controller. You can do it in an animated way that allows you to remove or dismiss the view controller that you're coming from when you come back from the segue. Let's go over to Xcode. If you take a look at the files in this project, there's two view controllers. There's a main view controller and a flip side view controller. Now what I have displayed here is the .h's for the two of them. The main being on the top and the flip side being on the bottom. The main simply imports the header for the flip side view controller, and it conforms to a delegate, flip side view controller delegate, which is actually defined in the header file for the flip side controller. If you go down here, you see the protocol definition, and it's simply one method saying flip side view controller did finish. In other words, the flip side controller it sends a message to the main controller when it's completed, and there's a parameter which is the controller itself. In other words, it passes back itself. This class definition is here to make this protocol definition valid because the class hasn't been defined yet. It's done down here. Flip side view controller has a property which is a delegate. In other words, it wants a reference to the main view controller. And that delegate has to conform to the flip side view controller delegate protocol, which it does up here. In other words, the upper one conforms to the one down here. This has a reference called delegate back to the main controller. There's an action, and this is the done button in the flip side, and it's simply done. Takes an ID and normal sender. Now let's jump over to the storyboard and take a look at that before we go into the .m files. Okay, this storyboard is selected. the navigation pane is closed. I've opened the document outline and a bunch of the disclosure triangles, and I have the inspector over the right hand side. You'll notice that there's the main view controller, and under its view there is simply a button. That's the one that's currently selected. Down the flip side controller we have a navigation bar. That's what's over here. You see these quite a bit in applications. All this really is a title and a button. And it has a bar button down here. Now, the type of the button in the main controller, going over to the attribute, is simply an info light. There's a whole bunch of possibilities of different kinds of buttons. If I go over and actually look at the connection for that, you'll see it actually triggers the segue. That's actually, and I'll show you how to create these in the end of the episode. We'll actually delete these and then recreate it. If I select this button over here, see that one is connected to the done action in the flip side controller. If I go back to the attribute inspector, oops, okay, and I actually select the segue, there are different types of segues, and this really is based on really how it animates and whether it's modal or just pops up from the bottom. There's an identifier here, and this will come into play when we look at the .m. This is a string which you can actually test for. At this point, I'm just trying to encourage you to probe around in the storyboard. Use the document outline as a guide and look through the various inspectors. Let's go over and look at the .m's. Okay, we're looking at the .m for the main view controller, and there's two methods of interest here. There's prepare for segue, which is a method that gets invoked before the transition to the other view controller. And there's a flip side view controller did finish method, which is invoked when the done button is pressed in the flip side view controller. This is actually defined in the protocol that we discussed earlier. Taking a look at the prepare for segue first, what's passed in is a reference to the segue and a reference to the control that caused it to happen, which is the button. Now, I had mentioned this notion of identifier for the segue, and there was a string, show alternate. All this if does is just verify that the segue that we're talking about is that segue, which isn't really necessary in this case. All that happens here is that the destination view controller is gotten from the segue. In other words, what view controller are we going to? And set delegate is set to self. So in other words, the delegate for the flip side view controller is the main view controller. Now, delegate is a property. This could have been dot notation. Instead, they're using the setter, set delegate. Now, taking a look at when this comes back, what ends up happening is it does a dismiss. In other words, the main view controller is now dismissing the flip side view controller in an animated way. Let's not worry about completion right now because we haven't talked about blocks. That's not really relevant at this point. Okay, so that's the main view controller .m. Let's go to the next slide and we'll take a look at the flip side view controller .m. Now, the flip side view controller .m is extraordinarily simple. All that has to happen is the handling of the done action as a result of the done button. Self.delegate. So we're calling a method on the delegate that was given to us when we had prepared for segue, and we're sending the message flip side view controller did finish with the parameter self. This was defined in the protocol in the .h. So it's simply telling the main view controller that I'm finished. You can now dismiss me. Let's go to the storyboard and we'll talk about creating segues. Okay, in closing, I'm going to select the segue, make sure it's selected, and I'm going to simply delete it. Now, creating these is the same control drag that you did with actions. However, in this case, I'm going to control drag from the button to this view controller. And I have some choices here. I'm going to do modal. You can play with these different types. My segue's back. There's one thing I do have to do, though, for this to actually execute. I have to put the identifier string back in, which I won't do. That's it. I hope this helps. Thanks for watching.